Streaming is enabled, recording is enabled, audio enabled. Okay, we can start. And first of all, first just disable audio. First of all, this presentation is my initiative just to share some knowledge, but just so you know, I don't have solid experience with GraphQL. I recently started research this technology like a few months ago. Before that, I worked with a project in GlobalLogic and in other companies using REST and implementing different APIs using REST. And for me, it was interesting that GraphQL is kind of a replacement for the REST. Maybe not. I'm not opinionated so much to say it. But I've read a few articles about GraphQL, and many community people declare that GraphQL is a better way to implement different APIs. And this 1 hour will be rather getting started with GraphQL. And if you heard about this, great, you can support me with some discussion. If you see this name first time, you will be almost the same as me. A few months ago, I just accidentally spotted on this technology. I was interested not in GraphQL, but just dive into that. And this presentation will be a short list of items I researched. I get started with. I would recommend for myself to continue, and maybe for you also. And at the end of presentation, I will show my example. Again, I did that example not for GraphQL particularly. I had my idea for my project and sandbox project, and in scope of that project, I decided just to use the GraphQL for me, for the purpose of project and for just getting more knowledge. And most probably, I will not cover all items in this presentation, but I plan maybe next year, January or February, present another session about GraphQL, but it will be more detailed about GraphQL nomenclature, terms, maybe some live coding, maybe some workshop, I don't know, we'll find out. But so far, I have one code example I did, which I want to share with you just as a touch to the GraphQL. I also have 3 code bases like fork from GitHub, where people implement GraphQL starter kit, and from that we can continue doing with GraphQL. So that part I will definitely not cover this time. And next time, with the next session, I hope to cover that part and with some more technical coding. Okay. Why it's mentioned about case study and GitHub? Because when my test task was for myself is to get information from GitHub about my repositories, not from my account, but with dedicated list of repositories. I will show in an example at the end of presentation, but this is it's the first time I face it with GraphQL, exactly when I worked with GitHub API. And as I mentioned, GitHub implemented it's as it mentioned on agenda. GitHub API exists in with the 2 versions. Second version, it's implemented with REST, and they implemented simple API with GET and POST request and so on. But version 3, they decided to implement with GraphQL. But before that, about GitHub API and my example, short items from me I just collected from the internet. So it's created by Facebook. So this is one, and I think major item for you to know, that this huge company, they had the need in time ago, in 2012, they have the need to simplify and optimize mobile application, and they implemented internal specification and query language for themselves. But then they decided to open source, and in 2015 they open sourced it. And in fact, at that point, it was really specification and query language. They open sourced first some limited functionalities for people to use. I definitely don't remember that time, because in that time I even didn't heard about GraphQL. But like only this year I started with this. It sounds like this is common interface between a client and server for fetching data. It sounds also similar like REST, like what's new, but with the items I have in my slides, I hope to cover. But once again, I don't have much experience with this, and you are free to judge my presentation, my opinions. If you have some more details, let me know. But I will be continuing research GraphQL for sure. What else about GraphQL? It's rather a paradigm or interface, but definitely it's about how to make easier life for developers and for the application itself regarding making requests and rendering response. By the way, under every slide there are some references, some helpful resources. You can later, I will share the presentation. You can research more. And the biggest, I would say, benefits for me comparing to REST, we can simplify our communication with client, and GraphQL was designed for this. Let's say we have users and users' posts, users' comments under someone's post, and so on. And if you, for example, a Facebook developer, you want to fetch some data, most probably by the old API, you should have had ability to fetch one request through the REST. Then return some data, use some ID, get another request, again use some data, and implement some third request. So multiple requests is replaced by one request, and the request is properly configured, and this configuration is named as a query. So basically, you design the query of your request, and you also design your response. For those who works on bottom line, we have bottom line has bottom line service layer such as BSL, which is for me very close to what GraphQL is doing right now. I don't know the timeline of bottom line BSL. I don't remember where it's created, but maybe it's the same time, like 2012, 15. Maybe they were in US and they realized that Facebook is doing good things. But I faced it with BSL like maybe 6-7 months ago, and just after that I faced it with GraphQL. Like for me, it's at the same time. Okay, a few pros and cons. It's not a final list. I just researched a few items, and for me, it's more than enough to get started with. So you might remember that working with REST, with client-server communication, we have requests and responses, and when we have some errors, we have HTTP statuses, and REST is agnostic to the protocol, meaning HTTP. And when you work with REST, you have to know statuses of HTTP for properly handling errors. But GraphQL did a bit different way, and they provide you not the statuses, but just error messages. And you just communicate to the GraphQL server, and you receive, if it's everything fine, you receive response. If it's not, you receive some response with some messages. And as far as I understand from my research, you don't have the need to remember error statuses like 200, 201, 40, 400, 401, and so on. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. Maybe we get used to the HTTP and REST approach, and GraphQL for us it's like some, I don't know, new stuff. But for me, it sounds easy because I don't have to remember numbers, statuses, and I don't have to hard code them in my JavaScript or whatever code.
So does it mean that GraphQL still uses HTTP code?
It's used HTTP protocol, but it's not relying fully. I mean,
okay, but so that does mean that when you're writing like a promise and you're requesting something from GraphQL, you don't need to write the catch, the second, like, I don't know, catch function of errors. You can do it all in the
As far as I tested from my sandbox project, no need to find the catch, but you can, I guess, because they use also promises. I mean, clients and servers implemented for the GraphQL.
So you handle 404, right?
Yeah, I think, but it depends on error message. If you, I don't remember fully error messages, but let's say there are two error messages. One about 401 authorization, and second about 404 for not found. I don't personally remember how I distinguish this from GraphQL, if it's so, but I personally did not implement error handling so much. But this item is like the whole direction for me to research and test it.
Yeah, but you will receive both 401 and 4, and like, okay, let's take 200 and 401. You will receive them both in the success.
No, it will be error. It will be failed request, and
Okay, so you still
I'm
need like to
catch and
Yeah.
success and fail. Let me go to the at the end of
Okay.
presentation. In my application, I have source code, and I will try to fake
Okay.
fail request. We will see about errors. About versioning, I'm not personally agree with this item, but I found over the internet people claim that it's good. When old API was doing through the REST, using the REST, always there was version like version 2, version 3, and so on. And when new version appears or is going to be deployed, all methods, all, I don't know, verbs and so on should be either reprogrammed in different version, in different code base, in different maybe space, maybe just a route, not API but API slash version 2. I don't know, but they GraphQL claim that no need to care about versioning in such level as REST is doing. You just need to implement additional field or deprecate old field. Because working with GraphQL query, and you will see on later slide, you define, and this is important. No, it's not here. This is important benefit. I kind of missed that, right? Multiple making request. Yeah, I missed that point. This is important point, and with REST, let's say you fetch a list of posts about from a user, and using the REST, it depends on implementation, but most probably you fetch data, you request some data from server and you receive too much information. Let's say you want to have only post ID and post title, and that's it. But by default, many REST implementation returns more information. Like if you have data entity in database about posts, there is creation date, whatever, update date, user ID, maybe some relation ID, and it returns to you. I faced it only once working on partner select with bottom line. We had some kind of limitation of fields. I don't know if it's related on Java or whatever, but on my side on JavaScript, I could provide some property like minimal or not minimal, and REST returns me all fields or not all fields. It was first time and only one I faced it with bottom line. Maybe it's a wide known approach, maybe not, but
with this property, you select which version of the mapping.
yeah, exactly. It was about map. And I don't know, it's wide known standard or it's like a particular implementation of that REST, and that's it.
It's not like the standard, it's standard approach, which is actually widely used, but everything depends on your needs.
And if you
people often just don't want to have the
sure, yeah,
same request, they want to have different requests. Then you don't need to do property. But generally,
so
every time backend is responsible for that. The thing here is the same. The backend is responsible to recognize the proper version based on the request.
Yeah, but from the versioning, I'm jumping to the list of fields. You define your query. Let's say, imagine it's post request and payload. You define give me posts by my post ID, by my user ID, and in response you have an array of posts. And with GraphQL, you can define request, and you can limit or simply define what you want to return, and it's defined by you, by client. And in this case we discuss, it's defined by backend. So backend should have that mapping, that restriction, which field to show and which field is not to show. And in this case, it's defined by a client, meaning that on server, yes, there is defined code which support you to maintain what response you want to return. It will be more clear later with some examples. Different backends. It's one of items I just yesterday played with the code, and I did SQLite and MongoDB all together in one request. So as far as I remember, my experience, like with PHP, I should have set up some connection to SQL database, and it's separate, and I should have one request to SQL and another request to MongoDB, and then aggregate data in my PHP code. In this case, maybe if I have time, I will show you later. GraphQL gives ability to implement preliminary a space and area of code which can aggregate many resources. In this case, SQL, MongoDB, maybe others.
So you mean you just try to call SQL MongoDB without the backend directly from JavaScript? Because generally it doesn't do that.
I'm not sure, definitely. As I mentioned, I am maybe not so fully experienced in this stuff, but in my JavaScript example, I have one JavaScript file where I set up SQLite and MongoDB connections to both, and then I have just one JavaScript piece of code which aggregates, and it's one file, and I show in one page, and it's one request. But maybe it's cheating because in my example I have node fetch, and node fetch maybe helps me to get data, and I don't see it on browser. Like, let's maybe skip to our example if I have time. About cons, I'm not sure about this because I recently spotted on message that GraphQL by default does not provide caching mechanism, and if you work it with REST, there is caching mechanism working with headers, and as far as I know, it's like well-known and standard approach. But with GraphQL, no default behavior. I did not yet tested this stuff. I mean, if I request some data from server, I always fetch the live. I mean, I don't have cached version, but maybe need something to try. But for me personally, it's not a big negative stuff because many wrappers on top of GraphQL, not implemented and not maintained by Facebook, but other communities like Apollo, they implement caching mechanism. So most probably people start from client-server communication. They either choose JavaScript approach for working with GraphQL, or Java, or Python, or whatever. There are many of them. So I'm again not sure about if it's cons, but at least something by default is not implemented by GraphQL. This slide is about main terms in specification. Under this slide there is URL, and you can explore more. But and this is a small diagram how it looks in real. I personally work it only with query because I'm mostly getting some data, and mutation is about saving data to the server. As it's written here, it's read-write operation against GraphQL server. I did not have time to test it more, but with query it's easy because it's fast, and I mean fast to understand and test. And recently I played with resolvers. It's basically file or place of code where you aggregate different sources. Schema is the main. I would say it's main, and because schema is aggregates a lot of terms inside. and type and input very close, but type, let's say, it's very close, like in Java type, long string, not in JavaScript, but maybe in TypeScript. But having type, you simply can define your kind of entity. Let's say post, right? For you as a developer, it's entity, you understand, it's post on Facebook. But through the GraphQL, it's a type, and that type will have ID, post title, author, and so on. And this type, post, can aggregate subtypes like ID, which is number, post title, which is string, author, which is also string, and so on and so forth. And scalar, as I mentioned, it's string, int, boolean, float, and so on. I only work it with string and int, not yet boolean, but you know, sounds simple. And in 2016, I guess, Facebook, before 16, they did subscription internally in Facebook, and in 16, I guess, they open sourced subscription. Again, not yet used, but by the simple name, it gives ability to subscribe from one service to another through the event-driven approach. Again, not tried, but in one of slides there is information about, there is URL about video. This year there was Nordic.js conference, JavaScript conference, and there is a presentation about specification. If you're interested specifically in this, you can watch that video. As I mentioned, schema is the main, I would say, main term in GraphQL nomenclature, and schema is defining server. Schema is defining majority of working with the GraphQL server. And as I mentioned a bit, you have your types like author, post, I don't know, whatever, your custom types you implemented for your project. And types can be used by queries, mutation, and subscription. Queries simply using types to get some data from server, but also by using queries you can use types as an input. I'm not sure in this terms fully, but let's say you want to give me all posts of the user with the name Andrei Lundiak. So user Andrei Lundiak should be defined. User should be defined a type, but inside of query it will be like input parameters. Let's say, imagine it's function. Query behaves like simple function, and this all works with resolvers. As I mentioned, it can be aggregating or just connecting to one database layer, and then response. I'm not very confident in this particular moment because this is first presentation about GraphQL, and I mostly work with types, queries, and response, but simply reading, not maintaining server. But as I mentioned at the start, I have some sandbox code base, and hope the next session will be I will be conducting specifically for implementing response. So let's say this presentation is about usage of GraphQL, and second session will be about implementing. I will be doing this from JavaScript Node.js perspective, but if I have time, I will also try to do this with Java and Python. Maybe not with Java, but with Python, maybe we'll try. Not sure. Yeah.
Implement it yourself, or there is implementation of GraphQL?
Both. By simple, exactly, this slide about this. There is a GraphQL org site, so definitely reach out and read about. But section code, there is list of all available at this moment implementation. It's both client and servers. So GraphQL, it's a specification, first of all. It's suggested suggested by the Facebook to provide base interface to communicate client and server. This is kind of a very generic sentence, but it really does. I mean, it's specifications. That's it. It's like really close to the base platform to implement different APIs. And implementation of client and servers depends on language. Facebook use, I don't know, never heard, never tried, but they use language hack or hack what something else, and they implement servers on that language. I don't know, but also there are many implementation different languages, and this site gives enough information for you to research your favorite language and client and server. So after reading this page, you will be able at least to understand which tool I can use for myself, for my language platform, and how to start. What else? My personal sandbox, because I'm front-end developer, so I'm preliminary oriented on front-end, and it's Node.js and it's Express, because around both of them GraphQL implemented GraphQL.js, GraphQL tools, GraphQL based on and for Express application, and Apollo client and server. And this tech stack, I would say, for front-end development, but it's not only front-end, it's like a full stack development, because Node.js gives us ability to work in backend, and Node.js has ability to connect to MongoDB and other SQL databases, and it's minimum for starter, and for sure there is Java and other languages, so you can explore more. But why I mention my sandbox, because my test application is based for at least on this stack. Other tools, again, there are many tools on this page, so just simply read and test and try, and that's it. Like, need just time. What? Yeah, Apollo client is like my to-do list for the future, because Apollo formerly it was named as GraphQL server and GraphQL client, and I guess it was between 16 and 17 year they rebranded from GraphQL to Apollo, and Apollo client on their site there is information that Apollo client give you ability as a front-end developer to use either React or Angular or Vue.js or additional 2 frameworks, and you can work around your favorite frameworks and working with GraphQL. Similar with Apollo server, they have Apollo server Express. If you're working on Node.js, they have Apollo server core, and a few other I just forgot about, a lot of them. Maybe not a lot, but 5 at least. Vulkan.js, simply a platform recently created by one guy. This guy is in China at this moment, and he is author of website as a state of JavaScript on one of my presentation I mentioned time ago. But this guy just started working closer with GraphQL, and his idea was to combine Meteor, React, and GraphQL. Again, not yet started with Vulkan.js, but I will be doing some experiments, but it's mostly front-end related. Or at least I don't have answer for backend guys, but for full stack developers I have answer. Sorry, I will try to. During this presentation, I'm doing recording, and there is tool I use. There is tool I use to record, and the tool is really using my battery. So sorry for this minutes of my away. This very small, like 4 resources I researched, and it's really small because when I started reading articles on medium.com website about GraphQL, a lot of articles I've read, but at least these first 3 articles will give you a note how to implement GraphQL server, and all of them are based around Node.js and Express. And I'm more than sure there should be some tutorials how to start and implement servers with Java and Python. I hope I will find out time and research it, But if you are interested in this, maybe you will find out. Let me know. Just let me know information in private. But this video, as I mentioned, Nordic.js, it's this year. It's in October, and there are two people presenting about subscription, how they implement it and why they implement it. As I mentioned, I did not work yet with subscription, but it's nice place to start with. What else about this resources? Not much, but as you see, I noted that it's recent articles, and I don't remember I spotted earlier. But like, if you just a note, if you read articles from 16 year, most probably you will see mention of GraphQL Server Express, but now it's Apollo Server Express. So just a small note, but it's mostly about Node.js. If there is Apollo for Java, I just don't know. Never search it. Okay, this is I guess that's it from high topic. We have 30 minutes. High topics, high level terms about GraphQL. Now I'm going to show my example. It will be just researching code base, showing code base, and looking how it works in my browser. But before that, my task was for myself, for my sandbox project, was to fetch GitHub repositories, information about GitHub repositories based on my defined data. Let's say I want to fetch 10 repositories and information about them. I also wanted to minimize performance. The history of my task was I started with GitHub API 3, but just a few seconds after I started with, okay, not seconds, maybe minutes, I started with API version 3, I realized that they have version 4, and why not to try it? And that's the moment when I faced it with GraphQL. And last task was about using avatar URL, and I will show you how it works. But why I mentioned this as additional task, because it will show you how easy to design your query, and if you do using the REST, you would have a lot of requests, and if you do as a query API, it's only one request. Okay, no, not yet. Research. Okay, I will come back to this. Now I will show. So first of all, about general information. GitHub, they have developers, GitHub developer portal, and they have information about REST API version 3. And when I started, I researched their API, and for me it was first, what was I researching? Its repositories, and they have ability to get repositories and with some information. It was fine for me, but then after some coding testing, I decided to move to version 4. So let's jump to the code. I will show you first my code, and then maybe I will jump to examples, live examples. Yeah. So in my test example for GitHub version 3, I let me remind a bit myself, because I've seen it time ago. Response. In my code base, I have version 3 and version 4, and maybe let's first I will show you how it works in browser, so that you understand the code later. So this is my test application. There is item about GitHub API here in my application about authorization to GitHub API. I will not cover this, but simply not it doesn't matter right now, but it's related to our OAuth 2 and tokens, and no need for now. But my first task and idea was to fetch information about different repositories and some information like stars, forks, and so on. So this is quite simple example. And when I'm doing using GitHub API 3, it goes in many requests. So before starting the application, I have my data. Let's say maybe easier in this way. My data was about objects, about owner, and name of Git repository. So what you may know, Angular owner, but repository AngularJS. It's Angular 2 and protractor, and Facebook as a company, as the owner in GitHub, they have Jest and they have GraphQL and so on and so forth. So this is my data, which I wanted to use as the initial data for my application, so that I, as a developer, can change it. I fetch it as a JSON, but it doesn't matter. It can be CSV, whatever. Let me refresh. It's by default my application goes in version 4. So when I switch to using GitHub API version 3, it goes dozen of requests. In this case, it's option method because it's due to cross-region requests. But you see, it's dozen of requests. I'm fetching information because GitHub API version 3 implemented. So you take an URL for repos. You should provide owner, and you should provide repository name. So this is a definition of API of GitHub API 3.
So whenever you data links, you have to use Nomenclature.
Yeah, when I was doing my research, I was thinking, is it correct way GitHub API implemented? GitHub implemented that API, and I was not sure because it's so kind of silly. I want to get information about multiple repositories, and I cannot. I mean, they did not implement it. As far, when I did research, I asked Twitter guys, maybe I'm missing something from GitHub API, but they do not have multiple, and that is why every request about one repository information is one by one. And in response, it's option.
So they don't have any file defining function?
In GitHub API.3 version 3, no.
So it's not possible to have a list of all reports.
As far as I researched it, maybe again.
Even they have it on their own page.
You mean what on page?
They have a list of the repositories on this page. You can list simply from GitHub page.
But list is not the
Yeah.
How they do that? They do that the same way?
I don't know. Maybe they also aggregate. But I know that it's this endpoint I'm working with. It simply get information about repository. But if you want to get your as an account in GitHub, your repositories, it can be response with multiple, like forks, sources, and so on. But I'm looking to my request, and it's only options, and there should be get request also. Yeah, okay, it's all. So let's say default response of GitHub version 3 API is a lot of data. I mean, I don't need this. And the first and I think the greatest feature of GraphQL you can define what you want. In my case, I have a lot of information. So first, I don't need a lot of information. Second, I want to optimize performance of my whatever silly application it is, but it is. I don't want to fetch a lot of requests. I just want to fetch one. And about time, by the way, okay, I will show it later. On Medium and on my blog, links are in slides. I published an article where I analyze the timeline, and here, for example, it's 220 requests and it fetches 400 kilobytes. But using GraphQL, it's a bit lower. It's at least a performance improvement. But when I was doing that when I was publishing that article, I was testing this. I faced it with situations that I personally cannot avoid cross-origin requests. I mean, I did avoid with Node.js plugin course, but it's not okay. Ideally, it should not be in that way. And in ideal case, when you implement properly server-to-server communication, you should not have options request. And even option request on HTTP request with method option is small. It's nothing in return. It's just a request with some data. It still takes some time and takes some data. So my expectation, if I implement without cross-origin, with GitHub API 3, it will be less size and less requests. It's not fully, it's like half of valid request of this, because it's option plus get. It's another topic to discuss. It's not particularly related to GraphQL, but when I faced it with this, I also did the code using Fetch API. It's not XML HTTP request, as front-end developers know, but it's Fetch API. It's more than API to work with request client server requests, and I particularly wanted to test it on my application, but Fetch API has a bit different opinion on how to work with options request. So it's totally another topic, but just so you know. Okay, so for now, you just have to see that it's dozens of requests to get some data. Again, maybe I'm missing something, but about GitHub API 3, I researched it. There is no one dedicated API call when I can provide multiple lists in payload and in response to return. There is no such, or I missed something. And when I switch to for, but data is shown. I mean, I fetch the data, I show it. It's not so sexy UI, but still, it's data is shown. And let's say I want to switch to 4 version, and I will show the data is quite the same. Maybe I did UI a bit. I mean, the data in JSON format, but the data is shown on UI. It's a bit different because I mostly worked on version 4. As you see, it's only one request. It's post request. It goes to GraphQL endpoint, route, whatever. And in my payload, I combine the request. And this is query. And this query looks big, but it depends on my, as a client, needs. I want to fetch all information about all repositories. It's like, I don't know, 20 or maybe 40 repositories, but it's combined in specific according to GraphQL specification. And if I have time, I will show you the code. And in response, I have again, this response is kind of designed by me. It's not the default way GraphQL send me. I designed this response. I can change it. I designed it to have object, and in object to have data, and every repository I want to have these properties. Yes, I designed these properties. I mean, you don't be misled that too much information here. I just designed it, but I can simply remove my code, and I will have, for example, only name, whatever.
Could you please show how it's designed?
Yeah, no problem. So for this one, what should be? I will show you first query, because in JavaScript it's not. I mean, in JavaScript file it's not good readable. Yeah, no, in browser it's not so visible. You see, it's payload.
Yes, but inside of payload.
Yeah, you see it's. I will show you in a more readable way. It's this way, but it's very short. I mean, it's a short because I use only 3, and in my example I use dozen. But the key point here is this fragment, because it's used as a default. And this, can I show it an example? I will try maybe. Okay, maybe I'll try. This fragment is designed by me, which data I want from server. So let's say I want name and so on. This is query syntaxes, and there is no commas or whatever. But as I mentioned, I can simply remove this and refresh my page, and it will take only these 3 properties. So this is how easy to implement demanding your fields from the server.
Okay, could you show us also the server metadata?
Yes, because it's very easy on the client side.
Yeah, because I believe that should be part of the server metadata.
Yes.
Yeah, but
Yes.
I believe it should be defined the same way as regular REST API, something like WADL file or WSDL file, something.
I don't know.
Because you need to have some way to automatically load.
I can assure you that they implement support of client ability for client to manage what you want to return in response. But it's based on the query, and that is why in request we pass the query, because server takes this query and evaluate, execute on their space and return us a response. But how they implement it, in fact, I just don't know, because it's GitHub.
Because you need to know actually field names to properly map your
Yes.
query on server
And
metadata.
you see on GitHub developer page for GraphQL version 4, there is a reference, and I was based on this. There is objects, objects and objects repository, and by the definition how repository looks and what fields they have, I can analyze what data I can return. I guess it's partially answer to your question, but I don't see how they implement it particularly. I just guess that Boolean is a scalar, repository affiliation, it's their defined query GraphQL type. What else? Repository privacy, also it's not standard GraphQL, it's they implemented. And we when we develop our project, we also can define our types. Okay, let's back to the code. I hope
one more question.
Yeah.
So this is the example of how you designed on the back end, on the front end, what you want to receive, but actually GraphQL server is placed on the GitHub.
Yes, this is my particular example. I also
Okay.
have full, but I will not have time today.
So
I cannot.
Can you show like just the code how you combine GraphQL with Node.js?
Okay, I can.
Express?
Okay, but then guys, tell me if it's clear with this GitHub example. We define, we have query, we define our fragments, and just have responses. If it's clear, okay, I definitely there will be URL for GitHub and my article. You can research more. But if people asking, I have.
How you build GraphQL?
Yeah.
On the
Let me. Okay, I will close this. I have example, but I have to drop this one. next time, next time, next time, and also next time. I have examples. Yeah, I just want to run because it will be more connected to the code. This example is based on SQLite and MongoDB. But before that, every GraphQL servers, they have GraphQL Explorer, and you can experiment with your code. Back to the GitHub example, on their main developer portal page, they have also Explorer, and in my case, I have predefined it. I just will show you. I will show guys this example just to understand the whole cycle with GraphQL and GitHub. So this is Explorer, which gives ability for me without any code, just test GitHub API. So let's test it. Okay, it works. So let's say I want to have only name. And as you see in my response from GraphQL API on GitHub, I have only name. What else? Description, right? And this GraphQL always have hints. It's very easy if you have some defined API. It's easy to experiment. No description. For my example, it was important to have name, stars, and so on. And I will not go detailed, but just so you know, every server, at least around Node.js implementation, I hope it's definitely for Java and Python also, but they have this Explorer, which gives you ability for easier to experiment with your code. And back to my example, I also, when I executed my local host, I have this server, this Explorer, and in my test example, let's say what I'm using schema from. You don't need to remember this code, but just it's a Node.js Express-based example, and the main point is that I, as a front-end developer, okay, in this case it's full stack, but I, as a developer, implement a schema which I will inject for the GraphQL server, and in that way GraphQL server will know requests and responses. And in my schema, I define a few types. I define query, and query can be hello, author, or get fortune cookie. It's not a big deal, but I will represent you hello only. Hello, define it as a string type. If I would like to have it as mandatory, I have to provide exclamation mark, but it's just optional. And let's say, what does it mean? It does mean that I execute query with a hello. As you see, it's a hint, there is hint, and it's a string. And response, it's hello world, and so on. From where this hello word is taken? Because we don't see this text here. In my this is schema file, but besides schema, we need resolvers. It can be mock JSON, it can be SQLite, it can be whatever else, just data. And when I create a schema at the bottom, I have dedicated method make executable schema, and I provide my type definitions and resolvers. and in resolvers I
This method may
token.
usable schema is it comes from GraphQL, it's your own.
It's my own, but I have to follow standards. Like in this case, it's in ECMAScript 6 syntaxes. It doesn't matter here, but I have to provide implementation no matter what. And my hello query returns string. Let's say change it, right? And I implement, my server is implemented. What change it here? Nothing. I implemented through the Express, and it should work without refresh. So after executing the same query, I have changed hello world and so on.
Show in the DevTools how
Yeah, it's the same as I showed. Maybe it's not the same, it's simpler, but it's the same as it's done in my application.
Mm-hmm.
So it's post request.
Mm-hmm.
It goes to GraphQL route. It's always, I mean, it's defined by you. Let's show it.
In the case resolver, it's just name for the server component which will process your query, correct?
Let me jump to this schema, this diagram. For me, it's like some middleware.
Okay, it's again, it's just component which does actual
connection. Yeah.
And it doesn't matter to which one. It simply just gets the info. It needs to know how to process your query.
In fact, let's say on JavaScript level, in my resolver, I have another file connectors. I'm not sure it's like official terms of GraphQL, but in connectors, I implemented its JavaScript file about different connectors. This is to SQLite, and I combined some models. Then
you can
to
also
MongoDB.
do the same without connectors. Just simply return from your resolver definition.
In this particular example, I can copy this code and paste even into schema file. It's just the terms and file names suggested by community. Like this is resolver because it resolves. This is connector because it connects to different. But I can put it in one file, and what? It will be mess. But still, you see, it's this file. It's connectors. Yeah, it's not seen. It's not seen the file name. Sorry, but it connects in different sources. And in my result, I just return different objects, and I can use it. But nice place. You see, it's that hello query. It's simple JavaScript. Outer query, it's more complex. Get fortune cookie. It's a query which goes to the third-party API, and you will not see it here. Let's say, I mean, you will not see it in a browser. Get fortune cookie. It's again one post request with a simple payload, but with response and so on. When I fetch again, when I start again, it will be different response. This string, it's not over till it's over, is taken from API call from fortune cookie. This done is through the node fetch module. And a few seconds I will show you. Oh man. Okay, sorry guys, we have to finish.
Okay.
Thanks. Next session will be soon.
Thank you.
That was quick. Короче, получается.